Hello, my name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS Asia, recording here in Singapore, and I am today's guest host on Sound Strategic. The IISS celebrated the 20th anniversary of its Shangri-La Dialogue this past weekend, underlining the importance of in-person defense diplomacy in our region and beyond. And so on today's podcast, we're going to talk about what just happened, who gave the best speeches, what were the most interesting talking points, and to go through that, I'm joined by a star cast of my IISS colleagues, Dr. Bastian Giegerich, who's the Director of the Defense and Military Analysis Program in London, Nigel Gould-Davis, Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia, normally in London, although presently in Thailand, Evan Laxmana, Senior Fellow for Southeast Asia Military Modernization in our own office in Singapore, and Virla Noens, also in Singapore, Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Indo-Pacific Defense and Strategy. Welcome, everybody. So, Bastian, let me turn to you first. Probably the main theme of the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, as with last year, is the relationship between the United States and China. We had the speech from Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, on Saturday, then the speech from General Li Shangfu on Sunday morning. I think it would be fair to say that the second speech was the one that people have pored over with greater intensity. This was a new minister. He had some rather intriguing things to say. So what struck you about his remarks and maybe Lloyd Austin as well?
Thanks, James. I think one has to just start with the point that while there was clear interest from the U.S. side, there wasn't actually a formal bilateral. This time, Secretary Austin said on stage that dialogue shouldn't be a reward. The time to talk is any time. The time to talk is now. And as we know, there was, and it was very lively on Twitter at least, there was a toast, there was a handshake between Austin and his counterpart, General Li Shangfu, but Austin said on stage this cannot replace an actual meeting and conversation. And so in that context, I would say Li Shangfu's speech was in some ways relentless and unyielding in presenting the position of the People's Republic of China, but I don't think it was actually overly aggressive in doing so. Some of the reporting, some of the tweeting, some of the social media activity following his speech, I thought was a little bit overblown, suggesting that this was China's moment, akin to Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. I didn't think it was as dramatic as that. I think it was actually, maybe Li Shangfu actually tried to avoid too much that would significantly raise the temperature further. And the one thing I would pull out, I thought it was, in fact, to me at least, remarkable that Li Shangfu asked for the floor for a final comment, just as John Chipman was in the process of wrapping up the session, and that he asked for the floor again. To me, it felt like a signal that Li perhaps wanted to end the session on a positive note, suggesting that he was open to further conversation and debate. And I thought that was an interesting moment. Still, overall, the interaction between the two great powers will have done little to calm the nerves, I guess, of the many middle and smaller powers affected by the absence of a more direct and proactive defense diplomacy between those two big powers through personal exchange. That'll be the feeling that lingers for many of them.
Virla, you're a practiced China watcher. I mean, it was an interesting speech compared to his predecessor last year, a little bit less performative, less outgoing. He came across as cerebral at times, but he also had a particular quote at the end which caught everybody's attention. He said, when friends come to visit, or he said, we have a phrase in China, when friends come to visit, we greet them with fine wine, but when jackals and wolves come, we greet them with shotguns, which got a lot of people's attention. How did you judge the middle ground of this speech between perhaps those extremes?
That was a great quote. Of course, another great quote of his was, as we say in China, mind your own business. So I think that really pointed towards a speech of two tones, of two messages. One for the region, with whom China is clearly trying to speak to and find greater cooperation with and build trust with. And then one for the United States. And we saw throughout the speech that, the level of trust is extremely low. The United States and China painted one another as bullies. The United States, for its effort, tried to clarify very clearly that the One China policy, which is, of course, an area of great sensitivity for China, that policy is constant and firm, as Secretary of Defense put it. But then I thought it was interesting that for a speech by General Li Shangfu that was meant to be about a positive vision for the region, to present this new global security initiative that Xi Jinping has launched himself, it was difficult, I think, for countries in the region to perhaps really buy into it, to amongst the words of tension vis-a-vis the United States, to really understand and see what China was offering. And of course, we saw that afterwards in the Q&A as well, where some questions pointed towards the fact that China was not walking the talk, that actions and words did not match. And there, I think, there may have been some buy-in from the region, but a lot of questions as well. And China will, of course, be working very hard, I think, from here on forth to try and convince countries in the region that it has benign ambitions and that it is seeking to really be a brother, a part of the family in the Asia Pacific, as opposed to, as some countries fear, a country with hegemonic or desire for a greater dominance in the region.
So, Evan, let me come to you on that point. These speeches at the Shangri-La Dialogue are not generally aimed at persuading implacable opponents. They're aimed at persuading middle ground powers in Southeast Asia. So, in a sense, the way to judge the speech is how will it have gone down in Indonesia or the Philippines or Vietnam. One of the things that he said was that in an exchange in Q&A that Chinese ships and aircraft never go near other countries' airspace and waters, a reference to the fact that the United States does tend to do that in the Taiwan Strait. That didn't go down very well with a few of our delegates from countries like the Philippines. But in general, how did you think his speech will have gone down with its intended audience in Southeast Asia?
I think there's two sets of issues that Southeast Asian states were looking for in terms of both the U.S. as well as the Chinese speech. In terms of, first, the expectations. We've heard and seen from Secretary Austin 4 times before. So in that sense, this is sort of a well-familiar terrain, how Secretary Austin would emphasize partnership with regional countries. But I think in terms of the Chinese defense minister, there's a lot more expectations because this is the first time we'll be hearing from him. And so therefore, there's more anticipation of what he will say, how he would say it. And I think this is where what's interesting from General Lee's speech is that I think Southeast Asians are looking at two different things. One is the body language, the tenor, the tone of the delivery. And the second is the message. The message, I think in general, to be honest, it's nothing new. Certain red lines have been expressed before over Taiwan, how China sort of have a list of problems and issues with the United States. These are things that we've heard before, and we certainly are aware that no amount of criticism we have of the contradictions and the lines taken by the Chinese minister will change anything in terms of its behavior towards us in the region. But I thought the tone and tenor part was a bit interesting because in some of my conversations with the Southeast Asian participants, some of them actually described the tone and tenor of the speech as your friendly neighborhood uncle trying to preach to you about the openness of the current position, how we're willing to talk. Oh, but by the way, don't cross certain lines or things will get very bad. But going back again to the neighborhood uncle that we are willing to talk and we're willing to listen. And as Bastian mentioned, at the end of the session where he tried to cut John Chipman off because he wanted to express and emphasize that he's willing to talk. But I think from a lot of the key issues on maritime security, South China Sea, you will also hear those wondering, for example, you mentioned earlier about how China made it a point in the speech that these troubles only happen in Chinese waters and not others. You will find some Indonesians and even Vietnamese to some extent who would argue that the U.S. freedom of navigation operations were also targeted at them in the past as well. So in that sense, I think China struck the right tone and the right tenor, but the message is something that we've always heard, and it's something that won't change in terms of its actual behavior towards us.
Nigel, finally to you. I mean, you come to these events in Asia principally as an expert on Russia and its near surrounds. But what did you make both of our Chinese and American friends?
The point that really struck me, and it builds on one of Bastian's observations earlier, is, of course, the failure out of character for the Shangri-La dialogues of the Chinese and American defense ministers to have their own bilateral. And why was that? That was for Russian-related reasons. It was a consequence of the fact that the United States had imposed sanctions on Minister Li Shangfu in his previous role as a consequence of an agreement he had made with Rosaboronexport, the Russian arms exporter. And I think it's really interesting. We might get into this a bit later. It shows how increasingly Russia and American relations are intersecting with Russia and China relations. So there's something important there. Austin did, of course, acknowledge that there had been a cordial handshake, and for the historians, that perhaps recalls the failure in 1954 at the Geneva summit of John Foster Dulles to shake hands with Zhou Enlai, his Chinese counterpart. And the other point I'd make, and I say this as a former diplomat, is that it's the intense interest in this issue of whether the two ministers would have a face-to-face meeting just brings home the enduring significance of personal diplomacy. So the pandemic, of course, spread practices of virtual working across many, many domains. In addition to that, we're all wondering and worrying how artificial intelligence is disrupting traditional forms and modes of work. And yet in diplomacy, it still matters and will always matter whether or not these two humans are sitting together in the same space, embodied representatives of their countries, breathing the same air in the same room and interacting in that most personal way.
It's a good point, Nigel. I mean, we should also say that although there was one bilateral meeting which didn't happen, there were many hundreds that did. There was some speculation as to whether or not it might be possible for the United States and China to meet somewhere further down the food chain, perhaps at the level of senior officials. That, as far as we're aware, didn't happen either. However, we did have on the Friday evening, not an in-person meeting, but an in-person keynote address from the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, kicking off the event in good style. Virla, maybe I can turn to you for a brief reflection on that. What do you think Prime Minister Albanese was trying to achieve, and did he end up achieving it?
It's been interesting to, of course, see Australia make some pretty big announcements over the last few years. Of course, AUKUS being central to that, and that having caused some level of anxiety in the region, notably amongst some countries in Southeast Asia, and of course China as well, and more generally the Australia-China relationship seeking to be put back on track in some sort of positive direction. And I think that Albanese's speech really spoke to that. He spoke, first of all, about China, not only the concern around the lack of guardrails and the need for that stability should be achieved through collective responsibility, and that dialogue was required for that. And I thought a particularly great moment was when he said that the silence of the diplomatic deep freeze only breeds suspicion, and it only makes it easier for nations to attribute motive to misunderstanding. That very much pointed towards the current tensions between the United States and China, and Australia is clearly trying to send a message pretty boldly that these two countries need to get back to the dialogue table, but also trying to reassure the region that Australia itself is not being belligerent in any way, not through AUKUS, but also in terms of its relationship with China, and that multilateralism remains incredibly important, even if Australia is engaging in these forms of minilateral groupings. He mentioned ASEAN and the importance of this, the historical importance of this, but he also mentioned the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And here I think it was interesting again to see the link between European security and Indo-Pacific security when he mentioned that, in very strong words as well, the unacceptable fact that North Korea and Russia have both threatened to use nuclear force and how destabilizing that is. So, Australia despite some major defense announcements, really reaching out towards the region to say multilateralism is where this region finds stability in addition to deterrence. And we are here to have that dialogue.
And Evan, a similar question to you from last time then. It's Malaysia and Indonesia that have objected most strenuously to AUKUS, claiming that what the Australians say is a technology and capability partnership is in fact, in some ways, a form of nuclear proliferation. Do you think Albanese won over his critics?
Yeah, I think certainly the message throughout the speech, I think it's certainly hitting all the right tunes, as Rilla said, in terms of ASEAN centrality and so forth, the importance of multilateralism and even guardrails and AUKUS in terms of its transparency and trying to pair deterrence, not just in terms of capabilities, but also relationship and partnership as the reassurance part. I thought that in terms of him trying to dance to everyone's tune by emphasizing multilateralism, ASEAN centrality, the fact that deterrence should be paired with reassurance. These are not new themes. And somehow for me, the speech became less memorable because I thought that the speech has been hyped up over the last month or so as kind of the defining speech of Australia's vision for regional order. And we've heard bits and pieces of those visions before, but I just don't feel the speech to be particularly impressive in terms of a clear position, strategy, and policy.
No, I think it was a speech that had some positive reaction, but also it tried to cover a lot of ground, and so it's hard to stake out an argument when you do that. I think that's a fair comment. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other talking points of the event. Nigel, I'll come back to you here. So one of the most visible, interesting figures at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year was the Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov. He came with a reasonably sizable Ukrainian delegation, including his deputy defense minister. It was also his first trip to Asia in the role, and indeed for some time, he told me. What did you make of his presence, and how did you find the Russia-Ukraine conflict in general?
As you say, Reznikov was a visible, confident, expansive, and witty presence. The session that he spoke at was extremely well attended. He made a very strong impression, and I think it was important that we had a Ukrainian presence in person this year. We had President Zelensky beam into us last year, of course, so this is a developing theme for the dialogue. In the margins, Mr. Reznikov had lots of bilateral meetings, some of which have been reported publicly, others not yet, to my knowledge. They've been well reported in the Ukrainian media as well already. So he, in particular, I think his visit reflects a trend in Ukrainian diplomacy and indeed more broadly in Western diplomacy to redouble the efforts to engage broader global audiences, in particular what we call now the Global South. And that follows President Zelensky's own recent visit to the G7 summit in Hiroshima via Saudi Arabia. There was a particular moment that I think struck a lot of people in the session he spoke at. I asked him a question about the course of Russian-Chinese relations, in particular whether China's attitude towards Russia was becoming more sympathetic and favorable in recent months. And in response to that question, he asked a question in turn, not to me, but to his neighbor, Ambassador Tuai Tiankai, and said to him, I understand that in the Chinese language, there is no simple word for brother, there's only older brother and younger brother. So tell me, which word do you use now when you're describing Russia? And that got a lot of sympathetic laughter. So I think that was capped off a very effective performance from him.
And did you find that Russia-Ukraine percolated around other aspects of the conference?
Yes, very much. So we saw this last year, of course, and Shangri-La 2022 happened just fairly soon after Russia's invasion. So there's still a sense of the shock of the new and people responding to something that had only really just begun to unfold. This year, of course, took place sometime after the first anniversary of the invasion, so there was a sense that it was a chronic problem rather than acute one, but no less urgent for that. And we saw a reprise of the concerns last year about the implications for Asia of this war in Europe. Firstly, that any violation of the basic principle of sovereignty, any gross violation of that basic rule of the game, would set a dangerous precedent elsewhere. Europe's today could be Asia's tomorrow. The second concern, again reiterated this year, was about food price commodity inflation. But there were two other ways, I think, in which the theatres intersected. One was the nuclear issue. And I think this, if anything, resonated more now as a consequence of recent developments in Asia itself, in particular North Korea's progress in this development of ballistic missiles, its threats to conduct further nuclear tests. So that heightened the fear that was shared by China, I think, that a nuclear escalation in Europe, again, can set damaging precedents. And the final kind of read across, it seemed to me, it came up in a couple of the sessions, was the worry about Western budgets, defense budgets, and whether they might be strained. So new commitments now, the transformation of European security means more spending on defense in Europe, at the same time that Europe, for security reasons, is taking a closer interest in Asia with implications for defense spending there. Is that a circle that cannot be squared? Does that put too much potential strain on Western resources?
That's an interesting point. Yeah, let me turn to one other big talking point. Evan, I'll come back to you on this. In one of the plenary sessions on Saturday, we had a speech, as is normal, from the Indonesian Defense Minister, Pak Prabowo. He surprised everyone, including, we think, some of his own officials, by announcing a peace plan for Ukraine. He certainly surprised the Ukraine delegation and the European High Representative, Josep Borrell, with whom he was sharing a stage. The peace plan proposed a ceasefire and then what amounted to a demilitarized zone of somewhere between 15 and 30 kilometers between the two sides. Evan, what was going on there?
I think we now know in the last 24 hours, after we hear reactions from the Indonesian president and the foreign minister, that this was a solo initiative of the defense minister. It did not represent the position and strategy of the Indonesian government. And in fact, the president said earlier today that he might actually call on Minister Prabowo to the palace to explain his plan. So it's certainly, I think, clear that this is not something that has been properly communicated within the Indonesian government, let alone with Russia, and certainly not with Ukraine. But I think this highlights a bigger problem, one in terms of the Ukraine and Russia war itself, where Jokowi himself went to Russia and Ukraine at the beginning of the war with a less developed mediation plan of some kind, but the domestic narrative was that Jokowi would attempt to bring peace to both warring parties. And of course, that did not turn out as expected as well. So there's a history, I think, in this particular context of least developed plans being put forward without clear preparation. But more broadly, I think this represents a deeper, I'm afraid, strategic pathology in Indonesia's defense diplomacy, where for a long time, I think Indonesia is accustomed to wait and see for great powers to woo the country because of its geostrategic importance and geopolitical heft, but we're not really accustomed to putting our own resources and strategy to the test in major geopolitical events. And certainly over the last 7 to 8 years under Jokowi, the focus has always been on economic relationship, not geopolitical maneuvering. So I think this is where the disconnect between defense policy and diplomacy, I think, unfortunately, comes at the highest stage last weekend.
Bastian, maybe I can come back to you. So if Prabowo was keeping us on our toes with an unexpected peace plan, we also had an unusually strong delegation of European ministers. So Germany, the United Kingdom, as I mentioned, the High Representative Josep Borrell, but also Prime Minister Kallas of Estonia, who attended the dialogue. Could you reflect a little bit on what you think the European ministers were trying to do and whether there are any highlights?
It is important to point out that there was a strong showing. I think 6 defense European ministers spoke in the various sessions, as you said, alongside the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Borrell, and Kaja Kallas, the Prime Minister of Estonia. Perhaps I'll start with the UK's Ben Wallace, who talked about how Britain's interests fall as much into the Indo-Pacific region as they do into the Euro-Atlantic region. But what I thought was interesting about this speech was that it was fairly heavy on foreign policy content, but maybe a bit lighter than a lot of people had hoped or expected on the defense content. Maybe that is due to the fact that the new Defense Command paper, the new British Defense Command paper, is due to be released later this month. I thought Kaja Kallas' speech was very strong, making the case that Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine was an imperial war of conquest, and that many observers and indeed many Russians overlook and forget and do not confront Russia's imperial past, which now presents itself in this new guise. While I personally thought it was a compelling speech, it had that personal element, how she recalled how her own grandmother and her own mother were deported to Siberia back in the day. But I think while I thought it was a compelling speech, I'm not sure that it landed with delegates in the region to whom that war against Ukraine still seems, that's at least my impression talking to some of the people in the room, seems a lot further away than perhaps some of the Europeans hoped or thought it would be. So I'm not sure it got through to the degree that I at least thought her speech would deserve. The other, if I can just mention one other element, Boris Pistorius, the new or relatively new German defense minister, he almost like an aside in his speech, but he alluded to the fact that Germany's arms export policy, which is traditionally rather restrictive, might have to change into a more permissive policy as Germany is revisiting the foundation of its own strategic choices, but also the interactions and ambitions it has further afield, including in the Indo-Pacific. And the minister from Singapore traveled on to Indonesia and India, and he had a few defense industrial representatives in his delegation. I think that's a potential shift, even though it's perhaps still a little bit theoretical at this point, but it's a potential shift that will be of interest to a lot of countries in the region, but it will also be of interest to a lot of defense industrial players, I imagine, who were also present at the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Werder, you cover Europe and its adventures in the Indo-Pacific reasonably closely, so if you have anything to add to that, please do. I also wondered if you noticed anything in the speeches given by the ministers from Japan and the Republic of Korea.
I actually thought that the speech by Josep Borrell, the HRVP of the External Action Service of the EU, was actually very, very strong. Surprisingly so, because he doesn't always hit the mark when it comes to Asia. So, I thought his point that the region was facing both bipolarity and multipolarity was very interesting, and something that might have spoken to countries in the region who fear getting caught between U.S. China tensions and are looking for, a third way, so to speak, or third partners to engage with who don't necessarily, risk having them be pulled then into one direction or the other. I think also his point at the end was very strong when he said that it is very easy to end the war in Ukraine. That is not actually a difficult thing to do. If Europe and other countries were to stop militarily supporting Ukraine, then the war would end immediately. It would also, however, mean that it would be a peace of the cemeteries, the peace of the surrender, the peace of the stronger.
And so it's not about whether to end the war or if the war can end, but how the war should end. And for a region that I think, it might be feeling wary of the economic consequences of a conflict so far away, this was an incredibly important point to make. Now, when it comes to the speeches by the Japanese and South Korean defense ministers, interesting similarities and differences. For Japan, very clearly the focus was on China, both military assertiveness as well as economic coercion. For South Korea, an entire focus on the DPRK. But interestingly, a thread that ran through both was, firstly, the fact that Russia, tying again the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific together, neither Russia nor the DPRK should be allowed to succeed. And then secondly, that these dynamics that we're seeing in the ratcheting up of tensions and the use of this kind of unacceptable force, be it, for example, in the case of North Korea, having conducted 34 or so missile tests just last year, that this is leading to a greater sense and desire of enhanced deterrence by countries in the region, including, of course, South Korea and Japan themselves. Japan with counterstrike, South Korea with its closer relationship with the United States, now with the United States being able to and saying that it will send nuclear submarines to South Korea once in a while. So these developments that we're seeing in what is seen to be unacceptable military assertiveness, indeed aggression, be it the threat to use nuclear force, or be it the fact that North Korea launched 34 ballistic missiles just last year, that this is creating an action-reaction dynamic of countries like Japan and South Korea building their own deterrence capabilities. But then secondly, also, that despite all this, these countries are still looking for diplomacy and opportunities for dialogue. Japan noted that it has set up a crisis hotline, communication hotline with China, and South Korea, less so in terms of its outreach to the DPRK, but in any case, still looking for multilateral convergence, multilateral unity to try and resolve these tensions. And in the case of South Korea, to stop North Korea in its tracks through multilateral efforts.
Excellent. When the Shangri-La Dialogue closed on Sunday lunchtime, those of us who'd worked hard on it, I think, were a little sad to see the event go, and we must also now close this podcast. I would like to invite each of my panelists to reflect on one thing that they noticed at the dialogue, either a particular minister's speech or a scene, a thing that happened that they think our listeners might be interested in. So I'll go in the order in which we started. So, Bastian, what caught your eye?
Yeah, I wanted to mention something that perhaps people who couldn't be there are just not aware of, namely that in the in some of these meetings, bilateral meetings that go on over the course of the weekend, a number of statements of intent and memorandum of understandings were signed, bilateral arrangements were made, policy was made in the margins. So there's, for example, a statement of intent between New Zealand and Japan on defense cooperation, maritime security, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and climate change in the Pacific Islands region. So that's an outcome or at least an event that happened. And Singapore and Japan also signed an agreement concerning the transfer of defense equipment and technology between the two countries. So there's this, it's just an element of again thickening the thread around these bilateral defense-related agreements that are perhaps not quite as dramatic as reciprocal access agreements that we've seen in the past, or more recently a few have been signed, but nevertheless an important element of the Shangri-La Dialogue that perhaps is not as visible and as public as some of the discussions, but nevertheless, I think it's an important element of that defense diplomatic activity that we've just witnessed.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It was almost hard to keep up with everything that was going on in the background. There was a meeting of the Five Powers defense agreement between Malaysia, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. There was an announcement by the United States, Japan, and DPRK on information sharing, a whole range of different things that were going on in the background that other people might not have noticed. So I think it's a good point. Viola, what caught your eye?
For me, it was really the battle of the narratives between what China was putting forward and then how European countries, and in particular, in the case that I want to raise, Dutch Defense Minister Gasha Ollongren, when Cui Tiankai, the former Chinese ambassador to the United States, effectively said that Europe's approach to managing security in its own region had failed disastrously. Gasha responded that the war in Ukraine is in fact not the result of mismanagement, but that it's the result of not respecting the way that we want to manage security in Europe. And I think that really just struck at the core of what we've seen so far this in all these speeches by the Chinese interlocutors, but then also by questions from Chinese participants, which was a very strong narrative of we have solutions, we have a model and a way forward, we know how to create stability in this part of the world, and Europe and the United States are the ones who don't. And I thought her response in that respect was incredibly strong and very, very important.
It's also worth noting, I think, that in the point that Bastian made, the bilaterals, that China was the hot ticket and people were keeping up a running list of who they had heard the Chinese were meeting with. So the Chinese did not meet with the Americans, but they also did not meet with the Canadians, but they did meet with the Brits, the New Zealanders, the European Union, the Australians, and sundry others. Li Shangfu, I think, mentioned that he had 11 bilateral meetings in all. So he was trying to display that he had been meeting with most people, even if not the Americans. Evan, what caught your eye?
Just like last year, this year, I thought that what's interesting is that small states actually stole the show. We see this with regards to the Timor-Leste President Horta, but as well as the Fijian minister, who both talk about the importance of equality in the global rules-based order, issues like climate change, economic development, and these are all things that are not necessarily about the U.S.-China competition. So if I were the listeners, I would actually also look out for the amazing speeches and delivery of the smaller states rather than just about U.S. and China.
Nigel, final thought to you. What caught your eye beyond your normal area of focus?
Yes, there was a moment which brings together three of the themes we've discussed already. So, Ukraine Defense Minister Reznikov, the meshing of European Asian theaters, and the question of so-called peace plans to resolve the war between Russia and Ukraine. So, Reznikov was asked what he thought about such plans, whether impromptu and Indonesian or more formulated and Chinese. And his response was, no, thank you. We don't need anyone to mediate for us in the war. We need to win the war. But then, if it's a question of facilitating some sort of post-war peaceful arrangement with Russia to define the terms of that future relationship, that could be helpful and can play a part. And he said Singapore would be a good place to have that, and the Shangri-La Dialogue would be a good place to have that. So just to reprise that point that Bastian made about the defense diplomacy significance of the dialogue, perhaps we can consider the prospect of something as momentous as a future Ukrainian relationship with Russia being forged at a future dialogue.
Very well put, Nigel. For myself, the moment that really struck home to me actually was nothing to do with the formal part of the dialogue. It was when it had closed. We walked back upstairs after the end of the final plenary, and I happened upon a scene in one of the meeting rooms in which Singapore's Minister Ng was gathering to thank all of the staff at the Shangri-La Hotel. There were some 200 of them gathered in one of the rooms upstairs, chefs, front of house staff, serving staff who delivered the food for the meals. And he gave a short but quite moving statement about how the people in the hotel that over the last 20 years has housed the Shangri-La Dialogue were a big part of making the various ministers and chiefs of defense and heads of defense departments feel welcome and also well fed and watered. I thought it was quite a touching moment and one that makes us remember, for those of us who organized the event, how many others also contribute to the success of the dialogue and all the diplomacy that goes with it. So I will end at that point. So that concludes our discussion. Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and unlike an Indonesian peace plan for Ukraine, we hope that this one lasts more than a couple of days. For more in-depth analysis, transcripts, and recordings of the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, you can go onto the IISS website, or you can look at what was happening on our Twitter and LinkedIn accounts. And as always, you can find more information in our show notes. As we say for every episode, please do follow, rate, and subscribe Sound Strategic wherever you happen to be listening to your podcasts, and to keep up to date with future episodes. Thank you to my 4 colleagues, and see you all next time.